guys, it's Nicole and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we're going to talk about transitioning stressed orchids into semi-hydroponics. We're going to talk about transitioning species into semi-hydroponics, and we'll talk about transitioning seedling orchids into this grow method. Before jumping right in, if you guys like this kind of video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more orchid updates. Let's jump right in. So let me show you the orchids that I will be repotting and transitioning over. So this one over here is the Neostylus Loose Neary Dark Pink. And this one is a cross between the Neophanetia falcata and the Rhyncostylus celestis. Over here we've got the Rhyncolalia glauca, which is a species orchid. And I got these together. They were both in transit from Taiwan for quite some time. And when I received it, the roots were pretty dry. So as you can see right there, I've got them soaking, trying to rehydrate them, but the glauca, the root system isn't so great. Now the Neophanetia has some great roots, so it fared very well in transit. Now this one over here is the Cattleya valkyriana pentative. So this one is actually the white form of the valkyriana. I accidentally knocked it out of its pot and all of the medium came off, and I did not repot it quickly enough. So some of those new root tips desiccated a little bit, so I need to repot it. Now, taking a closer look at the glauca, you could see that the root system here isn't great. Everything's very brittle. We literally only have one root that's viable. So I'm a little bit nervous about transitioning it over into a semi-hydroponic method. But what I've done is I took a solution of Super Thrive and I have it soaking all day while I was working. So it's been soaking in there about 10 hours. So the goal is to try to rehydrate the roots. And although some of them don't look great, they'll serve to suck up some of those nutrients. So taking a look at the roots, this orchid has been in transit for God knows how long. It arrived bare root, and as you can see, it really only has one viable root. Maybe another one, if you take a look at it, one next to it is fine, but everything else is extremely desiccated. So have it soaking in this solution to try to get it hydrated again. Now, with stressed orchids, semi-hydroponics is tough because you see that one root there? If we transition it from a wet-dry cycle to an always moist semi-hydroponic system, that one root could die. So you see it's literally only one root. Semi-hydro is great, but you really want to transition orchids over when they start pushing out new root tips. The rest of these roots, they don't look great. They'll serve to bring moisture and nutrients to the orchid, but I don't want to push this species orchid. Having just one root doesn't give me very much confidence that the semi-hydroponic method is going to work very well. And I don't want to kill off that one root tip. So we're going to pot this up in an organic setup, give it a wet-dry cycle, and then once it pushes out new roots, then we can make the transition. I think it's important to be realistic with the transitions. In my experience, when you're transitioning an orchid that's stressed, it can set it back when you move it from a wet-dry cycle to an always moist system. So I keep coming back to that one root because I'm afraid to kill it off. Now, there's a lot of people who would transition this straight away, and that's totally fine. You might have a very humid environment. It might work out very well for you. But from my experience in my environment, I'm worried that that one root will die, and then it'll take some time to get new viable roots. So my plan is to transition it into a sphagnum moss bark mix, and then once it pushes out new roots, then I can go ahead and make the transition. Now, maybe I'll do it this summer, or maybe I'll do it next year, but I just need to get this orchid back to health. Once we get a new root system, I think it'll do just fine in a semi-hydroponic setup, but I'm going to be conservative on this one. For the Neostylus over here, I'm going to take a different approach. If you take a look at this root system, it's got some really good roots here. Most of them are completely viable, so I'm going to transition this to semi-hydro straight away. Now, with that being said, This orchid was used to having a wet dry cycle. It arrived bare root, so it had a long period of drought. So I have it soaking here for a bit. But my thinking is that it's very similar to the Neophanetia falcata, which I have back there, and that's a moisture-loving orchid. And the parent, the Rhynchostylus celestis, is also very moisture-loving. So the Neophanetia falcata, I know that in a semi-hydroponic setup, the new roots do very well. It's a little bit hard to see past this frosted pot, but when I transitioned this over, it did very well, and it bloomed for me 3 times in the last 7 or 8 months. So I know that this will do well. Now I know that's not the case with every single Vanda. I've had Vandaceous types that did not like the setup, and then I had to move them back to a wet dry cycle. But my thinking with this orchid is that it's a hybrid with 2 parents that do fine in an always moist setup. So that's my thinking in moving this over. Again, some roots may die off, but I think because this orchid has more viable roots than the Glauca, this will be much more successful, which is why I'm going to move it over right away. Another reason for transitioning the Neostylus is that it's a mature orchid. So it has 3 different growths, very similar to the Neophanetia falcata. It's got several fans, so it's going to be much more vigorous than the Glauca, which is a much smaller orchid. So it'll take the transition much better, in my opinion. So the next one that I will be repotting is this Cattleya valkyriana. This one is the variation alba, or the pendative version, and I got this orchid at Hauserman Orchids. So this was actually a gift from my mom, so I can't wait till this gets bigger. But what happened here with this orchid is that I was watering my orchids, and this one fell off of the pot and it lost all of the medium. So if you take a look at the roots, it's got good roots, but it fell out of the pot about a month ago, and the weather hasn't been the most humid. So some of the root tips, like that one right there, have desiccated a little bit. And that's my fault for not repotting it on time. Had I repotted and kept more moisture in the pot, that root tip would be less desiccated. It's not dry per se, but it's not what I'm looking for. Now, this is a species orchid. It's very small, and normally I have no issues with transitioning seedlings into semi hydroponics, but just given that this orchid got a little bit too dry, I'm gonna be putting this in an organic setup, and what I would like to see is fresher root tips. Like that one right there is perfect, but the others have dried off, and I don't know if they'll continue to grow. Maybe they'll branch off, but I'm gonna play it safe with this one as well because it is a species orchid, and I think it'll do better in an organic setup for now while it gets larger. And I really don't want to set this back. Again, it has one root tip, it has a new growth coming, but I'm going to be more conservative with this one, and then I can transition it into semi-hydro once that new growth is larger and we have more roots coming in. In my opinion, semi-hydro is fantastic for hybrid orchids. For instance, if you transition a sherry baby, that can grow into anything. But I'm a little bit more careful with species orchids because they do tend to be a little finicky. So let's repot these and let me show you what I've done. All right, guys, so I've gone ahead and repotted the Valkyriana in a mix of sphagnum moss and some bark. I had some leftover repot me mix in my closet. I used the rest of it, and what I did was I just put it in a small pot. I want to make sure that the pot is as small as possible so that this can dry quickly since it doesn't have too many roots. And then my goal is to make sure that new root tips continue to grow. Now it's got a new growth, which is great, but before I transition into semi-hydro, I need to make sure that it has a larger, more established root system since this is a seedling and it is a species orchid, and I don't want to set it back. All right, so now on to the Rhyncholilia glauca. So the root system was not great. I ended up leaving most of them on there because I think this is going to be a temporary setup anyway. My end goal is to transition this into semi-hydro. I left most of the roots on there just because although they didn't look great, they'll serve a purpose in bringing nutrients and get the strength back into this orchid. It's only got one root, but I'm hoping that a new growth pushes out from that new growth. And if it does, once I start seeing new root tips emerging, then that's when I'll be able to transition it over. If I were to transition this orchid over right now, I'd risk rotting that new root and it going from a wet dry cycle to an always moist cycle. And I don't want to do that. I know that semi-hydro transitions will set an orchid back, but it's best to do it when you have new roots coming out, and this orchid does not, which is why I opted for an organic setup right now. Now you might be wondering why I wasted sphagnum moss and bark, and you know what? I really don't have the time to baby this orchid. So some people may keep their orchid in a cup with a lot of humidity, put it in a humidity dome, and wait for roots to come in. I really can't baby this orchid right now, which is why I'm potting it up. And then I can treat it like my other orchids, water it regularly, and then it'll happen. Otherwise, a lot of growers, if they do have the patience, they'll use the sphagnum moss and bag method, keep humidity around the base and wait for roots. Moving on to the Neostylus. This one I transitioned straight away. Once again, it's very similar to the Neophanetia falcata, and that Neophanetia really likes its moisture. It's doing very well for me. And I know that the Rhynchostylus celestis is also a moisture-loving orchid. This orchid had very good roots in there, and although not all of them will make it, I'm confident that it'll continue to push out new roots, and it'll do just fine. Another reason for transitioning this over is that it's a much more mature orchid with several different growths. It's a blooming size orchid, and these are much tougher to to set back than an orchid that's much smaller. So that's why I transitioned this over, and I have no doubt that it's going to do very well. Finally, this is a hybrid. Hybrids are usually more vigorous. So when I think about transitioning over, I think of what kind of orchid is it? Is it a species or is it a hybrid? If it's a species, you really need those new root tips. That Glauca, I cannot do it right now. That Valkyriana, maybe I can, but I don't know if it'll do so well so early. But a hybrid, I can certainly transition over because they're definitely more forgiving than species orchids. Anyhow, guys, I will keep you updated on all of these transitions. And while we are on the topic of orchids that were extremely dry, I want to give you an update on the stressed Phalaenopsis orchid that we repotted about a month ago. So a month ago, this phal wasn't doing great. The leaves were very wrinkly. The roots were very, very dry and shriveled, and I'm happy to report that the leaves have filled up really nicely. It is now hydrated, and I put it in sphagnum moss, and it's pushing out some new roots. So the roots have started branching from old ones. I'm seeing new roots, I'm seeing a new leaf that's shown up, and I think honestly this one I could have transitioned into a semi-hydroponic setup and it would have been just fine. So I think whenever you want to transition an orchid, you have to think about whether it's a species or a hybrid. I think you also have to think about the orchid type. So Phalaenopsis orchids tend to be much more forgiving than a lot of Cattleya orchids. Those tend to dump their roots. In short, whenever you're transitioning an orchid into semi-hydroponics, I think just think about what type of orchid you've got. Is it a seedling? Is it an established orchid? Are new root tips growing? If they are, you're going to be set up for success. If you have a bunch of desiccated root tips and just one root, just like I did, it may take some time for it to establish before you'd really want to transfer it over. My end goal is to transition everything over into a semi-hydroponic setup, but I'm very conservative in my approach. Let me know down in the comments your thoughts about semi-hydro, and thank you guys so much for watching. I'll talk to you guys soon. Bye.